Okay, so I'm sewing the panel undies from Rad Patterns, and I'm not going to sew them exactly like the instructions. Instead, I'm going to show them with completely encased seams on the inside, so that you don't have anything that's like rubbing anywhere uncomfortable, or just if you're someone that doesn't like seams or like the seam allowance and thread touching, this is how I sew them. So I've cut the side pieces out. They're set over here for now. And then I've double cut the like body part of it. I did mine without the crotch seam. The instructions include either having a crotch seam or not, but in the spirit of less seams, no crotch seam. Instead of cutting the little gusset that just covers here, I've just cut 2 of this middle main piece. So no gusset and instead 2 of this. And that's how we're gonna get the seams kind of tucked in here with the side panels sewn in. So everything's nice and clean from both sides. So depending on how you like to work, you can partially baste this, but you're going to be flipping it a lot, so I don't really recommend it. If you're feeling super nervous about like things falling apart from just pins, you can, but again, I would say like try it without and just with pins. So I have these 2 pieces, my outer and then what's going to be my inside, like against the body layer, and they are wrong sides together. I know this one's black, so you can't really tell, but the wrong side is facing here and the right side is facing out. And this is how I want them to be when the whole thing is completely finished. So when I'm done sewing, this is the back, this is the front, and then they'll have sides on here. Now the sides are not double cut. I'm just doing one. You can double cut them if you want, and then just baste those together and treat them like they're one piece with the whatever your inside fabric as like the wrong side, and then whatever your body fabric is as the outside. That would be the only difference if you want to double cut the sides for like them to be a little bit tighter fitting, or maybe add some additional compression, something like that. I didn't do it because it's not necessary and I'm going for lightweight, but that's how you want to situate things. So I'm gonna set that aside again. So it gets a little tricky, and the reason that I've used black for my inner and the print for my outer is so hopefully it will show up better on the camera. We'll see how this goes. But to start with, I'm going to take one of my sides. It does not matter which one. The only thing that matters is you look at it against your body fabric and you figure out which side it goes on. So the longer edge is going to sew to the back where it matches this longer edge, and same thing with your other side. So I know this goes on this side because when it's finished, they'll both be right sides facing out. So that's how I want to line that up. I'm going to set my other side aside for now. So if you were just sewing these normal, you'd be lining these pieces up like so. And one of the things that you'll see on some of our patterns is something that's kind of called like a dog ear or just a corner to the piece. And what that is, hopefully you can see this in the camera, is this little kind of like triangle that happens up here. And the reason for that is that we want the line where you're sewing, that 1/2 inch seam allowance, to line up, but the cut edge, because of a really angled or really curved piece, might not line up correctly because you want when it's sewn for that to line up. Sometimes if you make the edges line up and you true the pattern, your sewing line is no longer lined up. So we focus on the sewing line. You can kind of see that point here is 1/2 inch in. So you'll want to line things up, and you're only going to pin through your outer fabric layers. So I know you have these stuck together, and the reason I would say don't baste them is because you only want to pin to start with through these. So you can also use clips. I use clips sometimes. I'm faster with pins. I know a lot of people love clips. I don't know, it's just not my jam. Okay, so I've got those pinned together, right sides together, just along that back side seam. Now, the way that I'm going to have this finished, you're gonna have your seam on the outside, so that's nice and clean, and your seam allowance is on the inside. And because they're pinned, I can kind of manipulate it and pull it this way. And I know that I want all of this extra seam allowance to end up tucked in here. So I know that in order to have that clean when I'm done, I'm gonna flip this, that I need this edge here, everything facing like that. And this edge is gonna have to fold under and go in there with it. So in order to accomplish that, it's gonna seem wrong, like you're sewing it the wrong way. And it's easiest on the first couple of pieces. It gets trickier when we get to the last ones. You have to start kind of like pulling things through. We'll get there. But I'm going to flip this so that it is right side. The right side of my black fabric is against the wrong side of my side piece. And I'm gonna again line that up along the sewing line. And then I'm gonna go ahead and just repin it. And I'm gonna put my pins in vertically just so I can show you what that seam's gonna kind of look like when it's done. It's easier to do with the pins vertical, but I am gonna flip them before I sew because I don't like sewing with vertical pins. Okay, so that's where my stitch line will be, give or take. Didn't do the straightest job pinning ever. And you can see when I fold this back over, I have a clean edge here, I have a clean edge here, and all of my seam allowance is hidden in here between my outer and inner layers of fabric. So I'm gonna flip those back over just so I can access my seam. And then I just said I wasn't going to sew it this way and I was going to repin, but I've changed my mind, so we're just gonna go with it. We'll see what happens. If it goes poorly, I'll do it different on the next one. So you want to line up. Remember, we use a 1/2 inch seam allowance on all of our patterns at Rad Patterns. So make sure the edge of your fabric is lined up with where it says 1/2 inch on your machine. If you're using a regular sewing machine instead of a serger, you'll still want to have that 1/2 inch. My serger is going to cut some off. If you're using a regular sewing machine, make sure you're using a stretchy stitch. So I'm going to get going. Don't know where my little snip scissors ran off to, so we're going to use paper scissors because that's what I have. All right, so I've got this one seam sewn, all 3 layers together, and when I fold everything out how it's going to be at the end, you can see clean on the outside, clean on the inside, and then my seam allowance is just hiding in here. All right, so it's going to get a little bit trickier as we go, but it's all the same concept as far as the layers you're sewing together and kind of what order you're sewing them in. So now I want to sew this same thing, but on this side. So I'm going to get my other side. This part's not going to be trickier yet because you're doing exactly the same thing. So I'm going to fold this over. I'm going to line up my right sides together of just my outer fabric and pin those. Okay, and then just like before, I'm going to kind of situate it how it's going to be on the body because that helps me visualize how my seams should lay. So I know that this raw edge needs to end up tucked under like this. So in order to do that, I can't just flip it over like before since it's now sewn here. So instead, so that I don't get my layers messed up, this is an important part. I'm going to pinch all 3 of them how they are laying here. I'm only pinching through the seam allowance that's folded under on my black piece. And the reason I'm doing that is just so I don't lose the order that they're in. And the next thing I'm going to do is add a new pin and pin through just those 3 layers. So both my outer fabrics and the seam allowance for the inner fabric. Once that's pinned, they're not going to separate. And I can kind of just pull everything through my like back waistline area. It's gonna be weird, but we're gonna go with it. I promise it works. You can see everything's kind of pulled apart. It looks really messy, so keeping this pin in place is what's going to be really important for making sure that it kind of goes the way that you want it to go and that you don't end up with like twisted pieces in the middle or anything like that. So you can pull things all the way through, you can pull them halfway through, whatever works easiest for you. All the way through is going to make it so there's less bulk in the middle. So that can be helpful. Just make sure when you pull it back through that you don't have any twists. So I have my 3 layers of fabric, and the order of them is the outer body fabric of that like middle section is right side facing the right side of my side piece. And then the wrong side of my side piece is facing the right side of my inner fabric, this black one. So I'm going to get those all lined up just like before, I'm going to pin. And then I can get rid of this pin at the top since everything is repinned. And I'm going to stitch this seam. Okay, so now I've got that one. You can see with it folded inside out that everything's kind of like this. So I'm just gonna flip so everything's right side out. And I really wanna make sure after I do this, you can see again, I've got 2 clean seams on the outside, 2 clean seams on the inside. All my seam allowance is tucked in there. So now that I've got it this way, I just wanna make sure nothing is twisted, everything kind of laid out flat and neat. The more pieces we get sewn on, the more you're gonna just wanna make sure you're not like accidentally catching, or the more seams we get, we don't have any more pieces, but the more you wanna make sure that you're not just like accidentally catching something weird. So again, I like to fold things how they're going to be when you're all done. Really helps me visualize how my seam allowance should sit. So this is the front of my panel undies. This is the side that's gonna connect here to this front edge. And so what I want to do here is think through, okay, if I were just sewing without cleaning all the seams, I just had an outer and an inner, I'd leave this one out of it, and this side and this front would go right sides together, right? So I'm going to go ahead and pin those right sides together. Okay, so that's where my seam will be. Now I have the inside. Again, make sure your fabric hasn't like twisted, because you don't want to get this all finished and have all these nice clean seams and then have this like twisted around. That would really suck. So make sure you don't have any twists, and go ahead and do just like we did before. Flip the little bit of your inside so that it's right sides together with the side. So all your raw edges are lined up. It's going to look kind of funky, but you'll just kind of flip the pieces out of the way until you're able to really see what you have. And then I'll try to show it on camera as best as I can. I know it's kind of hard with the dark color, but you want your outer fabric of the middle piece to be right sides together with the side. And then you want the right side of your inside lining piece to be against the wrong side of your side. So that's how your 3 pieces of fabric are lined up. And I will pin these vertical again and show you kind of what that looks like. It's going to look really strange here. It's going to look like you have a twist while you're in the process. So in order to check before I sew, because I hate seam ripping, I'm going to just fold this over and pretend like my pins are that seam. And I'm just going to recheck that I have no twists. I don't. I can see that it's going to be clean here, and it's going to be clean here on the outside, which is what I want. So I'm going to flip this back out of the way so I can see where my pins are and where I need to sew. And I'm just going to go ahead and sew this seam next. All right, so we've got one more to go. It's going to be the most obnoxious, but again, you can just do a quick check. Make sure that everything that you have is how you want it. So if you do have to do any seam ripping, you're doing it before you get further and have to seam rip more. So if I fold these how they're going to be in the final garment, I've got a clean seam on the outside of the front, a clean seam on the outside, or on the inside of the front. My seam allowance is tucked in here, and I can see that there's no twists or anything happening. All right, let's get to the tricky one. It's the last one though. All right, so I'm going to bring this side around. I know it's going to sew to here, so I know these need to be right sides together. I'm going to go ahead and pinch everything together and just kind of shake it out, so all 3 layers, so that I know I'm not building any twists in because I haven't let these come apart from each other. Now, once I've kind of shaken it out so those things are out of the way, I'm going to pin just my body fabrics together again. Right sides together. I'm going to get the whole thing so that my lining is facing outside, basically like how your sewn undies are going to be, but just inside out. And just like all the other seams, I know that this edge needs to get tucked under here. So like we did on the back, I'm going to fold that under, kind of pinch them together, and just add 1 extra pin to hold them in place so I know everything's in the right order. And then I'm going to pull all of this kind of through this front waist opening. You don't have to pull the whole undies through, just enough to get your seam. You can pull the whole thing through if you want. It'll just be more effort to put it back after. So I had my pin with everything in the right order so it stays together. And then I'm just going to get these lined up. Just like the other layers, you want your outer body and your side to be right sides together with each other. And then you want your inner lining to be right side against the wrong side of the side. It's a lot of the word side. Hopefully that made sense. And I'm just gonna resituate my pins so they're going through all the layers. Get rid of this extra one. And let's get this seam sewn. So I've got that seam sewn. I'm just going to pull that back through and get everything right sides out. And you can see I've got clean seams on both fronts, clean seams on both the backs. And if I turn this inside out, clean seams on all of my inside seams. So no itchy seam allowance or thread against the body at this point. I'm going to snip off most of this excess thread because we're going to finish those edges. Now, this pattern, all of our underwear patterns, comes with like 87 different ways to finish the edges. That's an exaggeration. There are not 87, but I think there are like 8-ish. It's been almost 7 years since we made that pattern. I don't remember exactly how many there are, but there's a lot, and it's just to give you different options because everybody has like different wearing preferences, how they want things to fit. Now, if you've got someone that wants this whole seamless feel, most likely a fold over elastic, if there's one that's comfortable for them, or a binding, are gonna be what most people want if they're really, really sensitive to seams. The recipient of these does not mind serged seams on the bands. So in order for me to just make everything on my serger, make my life easy, since it's not a sensory issue for the recipient, I'm just going to sew the bands like this one. This was our trial pair, didn't fit right, so I made some fit adjustments. But you can see it's just like this serged edge with the band. So that's how I'm gonna finish them. You can use any of the ways in the instructions. This is one of the ways in the instructions to finish them. And then you're kind of all set with a pair of undies that doesn't have rubbing seams that will rub along these panel lines. Which is a nice way to use up scrap fabric or like actual panels of fabric that are intended for undies by having these seams, so you're not using such a big piece, but it gets rid of some of that kind of sensory uncomfortableness. So this is how you'll get no seams, and then you'll just finish with whatever your choice of finishing is.